Southern England, 5:19 a.m. The fog lay low over Newcastle Field, heavy and wet, the kind that swallowed sound and turned the runway into a strip of dim, grey wool. The ground hummed beneath my boots, steady, mechanical, like some buried engine was idling under the earth. I was on my way to the hangar, collar turned up against the cold, when a sound rose through the mist. Not allied. Not familiar. A deep, predatory growl, low RPM, tight compression, the kind of note you felt in your ribs before you heard it in your ears. I stopped walking. Every instinct I had went still. Through the milky veil of fog, a shape materialized, sleek, narrow, predatory. For a moment I thought my eyes were playing tricks. But no. The silhouette was unmistakable. A German Rheinwolf 210. The same aircraft that had shredded 3 of our P-38s the week before. The aircraft no one here had even seen up close, only as smoke trails and wreckage. But this one was landing. Calm. Controlled. As if returning home. Its wheels kissed the wet runway, bounced once, rolled out. The engine coughed down to idle. I could hear the blades ticking as they slowed. When the canopy slid open, the pilot inside turned his head slowly, goggles up, breath white in the cold air. He froze the moment he saw the uniforms rushing toward him. And my first thought wasn't about the danger. It was a question that cut through the fog sharper than any alarm. Why did Germany's deadliest fighter just deliver itself into our hands? Southern England, July 1942. By then, Newcastle Field was more mud than England. The wind came in low from the channel, carrying salt, cold, and the distant rumble of someone else's war. Our P-38 sat in 2 neat rows along the dispersal pads, aluminum skins beating with drizzle, like racehorses kept in a pen while someone argued about the rules. On paper, we controlled the air. The report said so. Charts with clean arrows, tonnage dropped, sorties flown. In the operations hut, officers bent over maps and called it air superiority. Out by the blast pens, I scraped burnt magnesium off engine cowlings and called it something else. Newcastle Field wasn't meant to be glamorous. It was a support strip, concrete, pierced steel planking, a few hangars that leaked when the rain came sideways. American P-38 Lightnings flying cover for RAF bombers. Officially, everything had a number, a paragraph, a doctrine. Unofficially, everything had a sound, a smell, and a failure point. The rule that hung over all of it was simple enough to fit on a wall. Order number 12, any enemy aircraft must be destroyed before crossing the coastline. The words were painted in black above the main ops board. Every pilot could quote them. Every mechanic heard them in briefings until they blurred into the background like engine noise. On paper, order number 12 made sense. Let nothing hostile pass. Clean, decisive, uncompromising. But the sky didn't care about orders, and neither did the weather. Radar screens bloomed with false echoes every time the sea mist rolled in. Vacuum tubes failed. Antennas iced over. Men squinted through frosted canopies and tried to make life-or-death calls on shapes that might be fighters, or might just be clouds. The Rheinwolf 210 changed the tone of those briefings. Nobody admitted it directly, but I could hear it in the way voices tightened when its name came up. A fast-climbing, hard-turning German interceptor with enough firepower in its nose to erase a P-38 in a 1-second burst. For 2 months it had come and gone over our sector, cutting bombers, shredding escorts, then vanishing back into cloud like a stone thrown into deep water. Command filed it under enemy high-performance fighter, data incomplete. We filed it under something simpler, the Wolf. The pilot spoke about it the way men talk about a pain they don't want the doctor to confirm. Short phrases. Half sentences. The kind of silence that says more than any report. I learned its presence by aftermath first. Twisted spars. Wing roots torn open. Bullet impact patterns too tight, too concentrated to be random. I would run a hand along the torn aluminum and see the geometry of the attack, a single pass, perfect closure speed, the K*LL made before our boys had time to improvise. Then the forms would arrive, loss statements, maintenance logs, parts requisitions, each one pretending this was just another mechanical failure. The official doctrine stayed the same. Engage on sight. Maintain altitude advantage. Do not deviate from approved intercept patterns. Those sentences were written by men who had never heard a pilot's last breath cut off mid-transmission. At night, after the last engines wound down and the floodlights washed the field in pale cones, would sit on an empty fuel drum and listen to the silence between the generators. The paperwork said we were winning. The hangars said we were not. Wings came back patched with fresh aluminum. Some cockpits came back empty. I was just a duty mechanic. My world was torque values, plug gaps, boost pressures. I signed off pre-flight checks while officers signed off tactics. But every time a P-38 limped home on one engine, glycol steam venting from torn lines, I could feel the gap between their rules and our reality growing wider. We had aircraft designed for one kind of war, flown under the procedures of another, and dying in the path of a machine no one at Newcastle had even touched. Until that morning, in the fog, when the Rheinwolf 210 came to us of its own accord. And all those neat, printed orders suddenly felt very small. Before the war, my world was flat land and long distances. Kansas plains, wheat bending under dry wind, sunlight that turned the metal of my uncle's garage into a low-grade furnace by noon. I grew up inside that garage. I learned the smell of gasoline before I knew the smell of cologne. By 12 I could pull apart a carburetor blindfolded. By 16 I could identify an engine fault just by the change in vibration through the floorboards. School was something I attended because the county insisted. My teachers said I had a good ear for engines. They meant I listened more closely to machinery than to people. Maybe they were right. Machines spoke in consistencies, patterns, friction, heat, timing. Unlike people, they didn't change their minds halfway through a sentence. My father left early in the war, shipped to the Pacific with the Marines. Before he boarded the train, he handed me a small notebook, lined paper, cloth cover, oil stains already at the corners. "Write down what you hear," he said. "Listen to the engine, and you'll understand the pilot. Machines always tell the truth." It was the only advice he ever gave that I didn't try to argue with. I spent nights in the garage while the rest of town slept. The radio played news from Europe, bombing raids, convoys sunk, cities burning, but it all seemed distant, like someone else's bad weather. I thought I would stay in Kansas forever. Fix tractors. Replace fan belts. Keep the same soil under my boots. Then came 1941, Pearl Harbor, and the silence that followed the news broadcast. Men looked at one another differently after that, as if some invisible ledger had begged *N to tally names. I didn't feel brave, or angry, or patriotic in the way posters wanted. I simply felt pulled, mechanically, inevitably, toward the war's machinery. If there were engines failing somewhere, someone like me would be needed. Training was quick. Too quick. Army Air Forces didn't care about the men who turned wrenches as long as the aircraft lifted from the runway on time. They handed me manuals thicker than Bibles, stamped with warnings and procedures written by engineers who had never felt cold metal at dawn. I read them cover to cover, memorized torque values, pressure limits, timing sequences. But the printed rules never matched the engines once dust, weather, and pilot errors had their say. In England, the first winter taught me something Kansas never had: cold can change the behavior of metal. Lines stiffened. Oil thickened. Bearings shrieked. I listened to every failure, every misfire, every cough of an exhausted supercharger. My hands cracked open from the cold, but the work demanded precision, not comfort. I wasn't a hero. Heroes were the boys climbing into cockpits, trusting their lives to the machines I signed off on. I was just a mechanic who understood that engines don't care about rank or regulations. They obey physics, not orders. And long before the Rheinwolf descended out of that fog, I had already learned the truth my father tried to teach. A machine will tell you what's coming. If you know how to listen. A week before the German fighter appeared on our runway, the first crack in the system made itself heard, not in a briefing room, but in the headset of a dying pilot. It was just after 0700. The fog hadn't burned off yet, and our P-38s were flying blind above the overcast. I was on ground duty with a clipboard balanced on my knee, listening to routine transmissions sift through static. Then a voice cut through, thin, distorted, panicked. "He's rolling out. I can't match his dive. I'm losing him." The channel erupted in static and heavy breathing. I recognized the voice, Lieutenant Harris, a steady man, not given to fear. If he sounded like that, something was wrong. Command answered with the same calm tone they used for weather updates. "Follow standard maneuver protocol. Maintain pattern." I heard the silence that followed. The kind that comes from a cockpit under violent strain. Metal groaning. Wind clawing at the airframe. An engine pushed past its comfort. Then Harris again, words clipped. "Standard isn't working, he's climbing under me." Static. A sharp tone. Nothing. Later they told us he'd gone into the channel. No ejection. No debris worth salvaging. Just another pilot added to the weekly count, the loss attributed to combat attrition in black typewriter ribbon on a form no one read twice. When the report crossed my table, I didn't see paperwork. I saw the angle of attack, the throttle position, the airspeed. I replayed the dive he described. A P-38 couldn't follow a Rheinwolf in a vertical roll, not at those altitudes, not with that wing loading. The German fighter held energy better in the turn, everyone on the ground knew it except the men giving the orders. I took the form into the maintenance shed, waited until the captain walked in, and handed it to him. "Sir," I said quietly, "Harris followed protocol. Protocol got him K***led. Unless we understand how the Rheinwolf is handling those dives." He didn't let me finish. "Weaver," he said, "you're a mechanic. Stick to your wrench." He set the form aside without reading it and moved on to discuss fuel distribution for the next sortie. Conversation over. I walked back out into the cold. One of our Lightnings was landing hard, smoke trailing from its right engine. I jogged toward it, tools already rattling in my hand. The pilot climbed out shaking, his face gray with exhaustion. "He came out of nowhere," he muttered. I turned like the book said. He turned tighter. The book. The doctrine. The rules. On the bench beside the hangar, I opened Harris's last transmission log. The pencil marks looked like the heartbeat of a man trying to outrun a machine that understood the sky better than we did. I could hear, even in the pauses between words, the truth we were refusing to speak aloud. Our procedures assumed control we did not have. That afternoon, while refitting a turbo supercharger, I tried again. I approached the captain during inspection rounds. "Sir, with respect, the Rheinwolf is exploiting energy paths we're not modeling. If we don't adapt." He didn't bother turning toward me. "Weaver, we have procedures for a reason. Pilots follow them. Mechanics maintain them. That's the order of things." He walked on. The inspection team followed. I stood alone beside an open engine cowling, the metal still warm from flight. A fine mist drifted over the field. Somewhere a generator coughed, sputtered, then found its rhythm again. That was the moment the system revealed itself, not malicious, not incompetent, just blind. Blind to physics, to reality, to the difference between a rule written on paper and a rule written by a machine in motion. Blind enough that men were dying inside the margin between the two. And I understood then that if anything was going to change, it would not come from command. It would come from someone who listened, truly listened, to what the engines were already telling us. July 10th began with rain, thin at first, then heavy enough to blur the runway lights into trembling white halos. By 04:30 the clouds were sitting so low they felt like a second ceiling, pressing down on the field. I was in the maintenance bay checking magneto leads when the radio operator hurried in, his headphones slipping around his neck. "Unidentified contact. Odd approach vector," he said. "Altitude uncertain. Speed inconsistent." That phrase, "odd approach vector," made the back of my neck tighten. Most pilots flew straight, or tried to. Only damaged aircraft drifted like that, bleeding altitude unpredictably. The operator shoved the headset toward the supervisor. Static cracked, then a thin voice came through. "Approaching land, bearing." Then nothing. The officers gathered around the console. Procedures were recited, calm, clipped, automatic. The weather made radar almost useless. The fog scattered the return until it looked like a spilled bag of nails. Still, protocol was clear. Unidentified aircraft approaching the coast must be treated as hostile. "Sound the alarm," the duty lieutenant said. My hands froze above the bench. Something in the background of the transmission, it wasn't the words, it was the engine beneath them. A resonance. A deep, uneven mechanical growl like a chain dragged across metal. I had heard it only twice before, on the intercept recordings from our last encounters with the Rheinwolf. I stepped toward the officers. "Sir," I said quietly, "that engine note." "Weaver, not now." But the sound wouldn't leave my head. It was too heavy for a Spitfire, too controlled for a bomber, too smooth for any twin-engine profile. And the rhythm, 3 seconds clean, 1 second falter, told me something was wrong. Not attack approach. Not confidence. Something failing. Another burst came through the radio, brief, ragged. "Fuel, instruments, no land, request." Then static drowned it. If he were attacking, he wouldn't be transmitting blind distress calls. The lieutenant moved toward the alarm panel again. "Sir," I said sharply this time, "if that's a Rheinwolf and you trigger the siren, our G***ners will fire blind into this fog. They'll hit the fuel dump before they hit him." He turned, anger rising. Our job is to follow procedure. I didn't argue. There wasn't time. My boots were already carrying me across the room to the old signal console near the hangar doors. Rain drummed on the roof in hard metallic bursts. Through the open bay I saw the runway, just a strip of wet gray dissolving into cloud. If the pilot was disoriented, low on fuel, or nursing a wounded engine, he might read the signal lights instinctively. Every base had its color codes, its patterns. Even enemy ones were similar enough under stress. I flipped the guard plate off the switch. The lieutenant shouted behind me. I ignored him. Red. White. Red. White. The emergency pattern for friendly aircraft in distress. Not for enemy fighters. Not for a German interceptor. Never for a machine that had taken 3 of our men in 1 week. The bulbs along the runway came alive, slow, pulsing, a beckoning line through the storm. The room went silent behind me. Even the lieutenant didn't move. Then, from the dark above the field, the sound returned, low, wounded, deliberate. The shape emerged last, a slashed shadow, wings narrow, nose pointed like a spear. The Rheinwolf descended through the fog, wobbling as if it were holding itself together by muscle alone. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't escaping. He was landing. Because I had told him, against every rule written, that it was safe to. The wheels struck the concrete. A spray of water rose behind them. The engine coughed. The aircraft rolled out and slowed, trembling on its own axis. Only then did I feel the weight of what I'd done settle into my chest. If I had misread the engine's voice. If I had misheard the truth in its failing rhythm. This runway would be fire and shrapnel. But I hadn't misheard. The machine had told me. And I had listened. The moment the Rheinwolf's wheels settled, the fog seemed to pull tighter around the field, as if the air itself needed time to understand what had just happened. I stood inside the open hangar, rain dripping from my sleeves, watching the dark shape idle at the far end of the runway. The prop spun unevenly, coughing like an animal too tired to snarl. Behind me, boots pounded on concrete. The lieutenant reached me first. His voice was a hiss, sharper than the storm outside. "What have you done, Weaver?" The answer was obvious, but I didn't give it. I just kept my eyes on the plane. The canopy cracked open with a hydraulic sigh. A gloved hand emerged, tentative, feeling for air. Then the German pilot lifted himself up, goggles fogged, shoulders heaving as if he'd flown through a wall of stone. He looked around and froze when he saw American uniforms forming at the edges of the field. He didn't reach for a *P***N. He didn't move at all. Because he had made the same assumption I had gambled on, that the lights meant safety. That he was home. The lieutenant pointed at the console I'd tampered with. "You've violated protocol, signal procedures, and direct orders. Are you aware of?" "Sir," I said quietly, "he wasn't attacking. That was not your decision." But it had been, not by authority, but by necessity. The rules were written for clarity. The sky rarely offered any. Up there, pilots died before paperwork caught up. Down here, we were supposed to keep the world predictable. Yet nothing about this war was predictable now, least of all the machine trembling on our runway. The crash crew approached cautiously, rifles raised. Their boots splashed through the standing water, spreading ripples under the halogen lights. I could see the shape more clearly now, the angled wings, the compact fuselage, the armament cluster under the nose. I'd only seen sketches before, grainy photographs, vague silhouettes. Never the real thing. The infamous Rheinwolf 210. Untouched. Intact. Delivered to us like a secret someone finally decided to whisper. The pilot lifted both hands in surrender, palms out. He looked young, most of them did, but there was something else in his face. Not fear. Calculation. The expression of a man who'd made his own impossible decision. As they escorted him away, the engine wound down with a muted clatter. Steam drifted from the exhaust ports. Under the central cowling, a faint metallic ticking, cooling metal, stressed to its limits. Whatever chase he'd flown through had pushed that machine to the edge. The lieutenant followed the guards out toward the aircraft. I stayed behind. I knew better than to insert myself where rank could crush me. But he turned back halfway, rain streaking his cap. "You understand," he said, "there will be consequences." "I do." "And you still chose to interfere." I met his stare. I listened to what the machine told me. He didn't like that answer, but he couldn't refute it, not now, not with a captured enemy aircraft sitting 40 yards away, its pilot in custody, its secrets still cooling in the rain. Men swarmed the plane then, ordnance teams, engineers, officers with clipboards that already smelled of ink and urgency. They circled it the way doctors circle a wounded patient, unsure whether they were expected to save or dissect. The lieutenant left me standing by the console. No reprimand yet. No order to report. Just silence, thick, uncomfortable, unfinished. I returned to the hangar and wiped the rain from my hands. The console lights still blinked their red-white pattern across the field, painting the fog in alternating bands of color. I switched them off. The runway went dark again, except for the dim beacon at its end. In that shadowed stillness, a simple truth settled in my chest with the force of something irrevocable. I had broken the rules, calmly, deliberately, without hesitation. Not because I wanted to. Because waiting for permission had already cost too many men their lives. A machine had asked for help in the only language it had. And I had answered. Whatever consequences waited, they would arrive later. But the Rheinwolf was here now, cooling on our concrete, its secrets still intact. That was enough to change the war. And enough to change me. They towed the Rheinwolf into Hangar 3 under guard, though the guards weren't sure what they were supposed to guard against, one exhausted pilot in handcuffs, or the machine itself. The rain slackened, but the fog stayed low, turning the floodlights into dull white pillars that made the moment feel unreal, as if we were receiving a ghost instead of an aircraft. Up close, the fighter looked smaller than I expected. German design favored compact brutality, no wasted space, no gentle curves. Everything about the Rheinwolf suggested speed and intention. Even the landing skid marks trailed in a line so precise it felt rehearsed. A major from engineering arrived, breath visible in the cold. He ran his hand along the leading edge of the wing, whistling quietly. Untouched, he murmured. God help us. They popped the cowling. Steam poured out in a white sheet. Inside, the engine sat like a clenched fist, dense, overbuilt, unapologetic. I leaned in and smelled the heat, the residue of high-octane fuel, the faint sweetness of burned glycol. The major glanced at me. You were the one who brought him down, he said. I didn't bring him down, sir. He brought himself. Still. His tone softened. We've been chasing ghosts for months. The officers swarmed quickly. Cameras flashed. Measurements were taken. Someone began sketching the wing route geometry. Another traced the path of the cooling lines. The longer they looked, the more their faces shifted, from curiosity, to understanding, to a quiet kind of fear. Because every piece of the aircraft told the same story, we had been outmatched not by numbers, but by engineering. The pilot, Lieutenant Karl Muller, sat under guard near the wall, wrists bound, uniform soaked through. He watched the examination without saying a word. His expression was unreadable, not defiant, not defeated. Observing. As if mentally dismantling the room the same way we were dismantling his airplane. The first breakthrough came fast. One of the engineers called me over. Weaver, look at this. He pointed to the airflow channeling behind the propeller hub. It wasn't like anything on our P-38s or Spitfires. Narrow veins angled with mathematical precision guided the incoming air across the supercharger intakes. No wonder they climb like devils, he muttered. I understood immediately. The airflow efficiency alone was worth a lecture. Smooth, disciplined, purposeful, while ours relied on brute force horsepower. Their machine preserved energy, ours bled it. Then another voice rose from behind the wing. Get over here. G*NS aren't no-centered, they're canted 3 degrees. That was the moment I felt something shift in the hangar, a current running through the men. 3 degrees was small enough to overlook, large enough to change everything. It meant that the Rheinwolf wasn't firing a tight pattern, it was firing a converging one. At 200 meters, every round met the same point in space. Perfect for 1 pass K*LLS. Perfect for what had been happening to us. The major turned to the officers. This aircraft is worth more than a division of men. They said nothing, but no one disagreed. By noon, word had spread across the field. Pilots drifted toward the hangar in small groups, pretending they weren't looking for answers. Some stood beside me, staring at the captured fighter with tight jaws and clenched hands. Is that the one? Someone whispered. The same model, I said. Maybe even the same pilot. They stared in silence. Sometimes anger looks like quiet. Sometimes fear hides behind professionalism. Within hours, the intelligence team gathered photographs, sketches, airflow readings, G*N harmonization metrics, everything that could be extracted from the machine before it cooled. Within a day, training directives shifted. Dive angles amended. Climb rates recalculated. Engagement ranges rewritten. Within a week, those directives were formal doctrine. And within a month, our P-51s, newly arrived, freshly briefed, began to turn the K*LL tables around. Not by luck. Not by courage. But by understanding. The Rheinwolf had shown us the truth without intending to. Or perhaps it had simply reached the limit of its own endurance, and fate did the rest. Either way, the machine that haunted our skies had given us the map to defeat it. And I, a mechanic with cold hands and a guilty conscience, had been the one to open the door. The official interrogation of Lieutenant Karl Muller took place in a small supply office that smelled of damp manuals and cold ink. I wasn't allowed in, of course. Mechanics weren't cleared for intelligence work. But word travels in places like Newcastle Field, not through gossip, but through silence. When officers stop talking in front of you, you learn more from the gaps than the words. By evening, the captured pilot had been moved under guard to a transport truck bound inland. The rain turned to mist, drifting along the runway like breath from something sleeping. I stood outside the hangar, arms folded, listening to the mutter of distant engines as if trying to decide whether what I'd done was bravery or recklessness dressed up as instinct. The base commander found me there. He approached without hurry, boots crunching over gravel. He was not a dramatic man, his uniform always carried a faint scent of tobacco and damp wool, as if leadership were something kept in pockets rather than projected. He stopped beside me and watched the fog for a moment before speaking. "You broke 3 orders in a row, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." "And you endangered personnel by interfering with an active threat response." "Yes, sir." "And you may have jeopardized the chain of command." I didn't answer. The silence seemed to satisfy him more than any excuse could have. Then he exhaled, long, slow, the kind of breath that comes from someone trying to balance duty with the truth sitting plainly in front of him. "But," he said, "because of you, we finally know what we're fighting." He didn't offer praise. He didn't offer forgiveness. He simply stated the fact, the way a navigator names a heading. Clean, direct, indisputable. That was all. No commendation. No commendation was possible, not for what I'd done. The Army Air Forces survived on regulations. To reward disobedience would have been an admission that the system had cracks. So instead, they wrote the report the only way a system knows how, with omissions. Enemy aircraft made an emergency landing. Circumstances unclear. Unclear. A careful word. Wide enough to hide a truth, narrow enough to prevent questions. For days, officers walked past me with unreadable faces. Some carried the tight-lipped neutrality of men preserving hierarchy. Others avoided my eyes entirely, as if afraid that speaking to me might make them complicit in a rule I'd broken. But the pilots, the ones who flew the machines I opened every morning, they came quietly. One by one. A hand on my shoulder. A nod in passing. A brief word in the shadow of the fuel trucks. "Weaver, we're alive because you saw what command didn't." Some didn't speak at all. They just stood beside me during pre-flight checks, watching the sky with the unease of men who had survived a pattern they couldn't yet name. Their silence said more than gratitude. It said recognition, of risk, of consequence, of the thin thread that had held them between life and death. The engineers worked through the nights, studying the Rheinwolf until their fingers went numb. I helped where I could, quietly, unofficially, passing tools, offering observations, tracing airflow paths with a grease pencil on metal still warm from flight. No one told me to leave. No one told me to stay. That was the shape of my punishment, unspoken, ambiguous, suspended between reprimand and necessity. After 3 days, the field returned to its routines. Engines roared at dawn. Briefings resumed. Pilots marched to aircraft with the same practice stride. But there was a new texture to the air, a sharpened understanding that the rules could bend if reality demanded it. The commander never mentioned the incident again. But every time I walked past the signal console, I felt the weight of that moment, the decision to flip the lights, to break the chain, to trust the voice of a failing engine over the certainty of printed orders. War rarely gives men second chances. That morning, in the fog, I had taken one. And the consequences, quiet, hidden, inevitable, would follow all of us long after the Rheinwolf's tire marks faded from the runway. The Rheinwolf 210 did not last long as a whole machine. Within a week it had been reduced to components laid out across 3 hangars, wings on sawhorses, fuselage braced by scaffolds, engine suspended from a crane like a dissected heart. Nothing was destroyed, everything was studied. Every rivet, every weld line, every angle of metal carried an explanation waiting to be translated. Engineers moved among the parts with an intensity one had never seen. They took measurements until the pencils wore down to stubs. They traced airflow paths with smoke wicks. They argued over pressure curves and harmonization distances. The hangar lights burned day and night, turning the place into a cathedral of cold metal and sleepless questions. I helped where I could, quiet hands passing tools, notes scribbled on scrap cardboard, observations offered in the brief gaps between arguments. No one officially requested my presence, but no one dismissed me either. Sometimes in war the line between authorized and needed blurs, and men learned to look the other way. Within days, the first technical briefings circulated through the units. They weren't public, but pilots found ways to read them anyway. Revised intercept diagrams. New climb strategies. Fresh warnings about the Rheinwolf's convergence angles. Our pilots trained differently now, leaner, sharper, more aware of the invisible geometry shaping every encounter. By the end of the month, the first P-51 squadrons arrived from the States. Sleek. Purpose-built. Clean lines and long legs. They carried not just hardware but doctrine, the updated maneuvers written in the shadow of the captured Wolf. The Mustang had strengths the P-38 didn't: superior dive behavior, tighter turning windows at medium altitude, a steadier roll rate. Combined with what we'd learned, the change was immediate. Reports came in like new weather patterns. Enemy losses increasing. Survivability improving. Engagements shorter. Confidence rising. Pilots began returning with stories that sounded like reclaimed ground. They talked about seeing the Rheinwolf coming and knowing, finally knowing, how to meet it on equal terms. Some returned shaking with adrenaline but alive. Others returned quiet, eyes distant, processing the thin margin between theory and survival. One evening, a P-51 lieutenant stopped me near the fuel dump. He didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "Your decision changed the briefing notes we fly with. That's not nothing." Then he walked back into the night. As for Lieutenant Karl Muller, they sent him to a POW camp in Montana: clean air, quiet hills, cold winters. I imagined him there sometimes, sitting in barracks light, replaying his final descent through the English fog. Perhaps he wondered how close he had come to dying. Perhaps he wondered why he hadn't. War turns men into reflections of each other, even on opposite sides. When the war ended, I returned to Kansas, to the same garage, the same dry wind, the same sun flattening the horizon into gold and dust. My uncle welcomed me back without ceremony. Engines waited. Tools waited. Life resumed with the steadiness of a machine built from familiar parts. Years later, my son climbed onto an overturned oil drum and asked me, with the bluntness only children have, "Dad, is it true America changed its air tactics because of you?" I thought for a long moment before answering. The war felt impossibly distant then, like a machine I had once repaired but could no longer touch. Sometimes, I said, wars aren't won by heroes. They're won by people who break the rules at the right moment. He nodded as if that made perfect sense. Children understand simplicity better than adults. Decades passed. One summer, a letter arrived from England with a photograph inside, an old airfield restored for historical tours. At the base of the control tower stood a plaque of brushed aluminum. The inscription was brief. Here occurred the most valuable accident of the air war in 1942. No names. No dates. Just the truth, distilled. I never wrote back. I didn't need to. Machines, like memories, speak quietly. If you listen closely, they tell you everything. In the years since, the morning remains clear in my mind, fog swallowing the runway, the engine's wounded growl, the moment I chose the truth of a machine over the certainty of printed orders. I wasn't thinking of tactics or consequences. I was thinking of a pilot fighting his cockpit, and of the sound an engine makes when it can no longer lie. They say every war has a turning point. Ours arrived not with a squadron, nor a briefing, but with a single fighter descending through mist, guided by lights that should never have been lit. I broke the rules, yes. But rules are written for ordinary days. That morning was anything but ordinary. And because of one decision made in silence, under wet English sky, America learned how to fight the wolf that had been hunting us. One plane. One mistake. One opening. That was all it took to change the air war.